Hey everybody, this is Rydo and we're back to video game news for Wednesday, December 25th, which is Christmas. So today's going to be a little bit of a weird day. We're going to have a little tiny, I think, warm-up section and then we will jump into the news. Inherently, I think I am going to do some things a little bit different today, in particular because I've gotten to a point as far as my decluttering, house cleanup projects that I need to get done, where I have a piece of furniture that I need to move and can't move by myself, and certainly I'm not going to get anybody on Christmas Day to come over and help move furniture, which might also be certainly revealing something in that with the house as in such a messy state that I certainly am not really celebrating Christmas, and frankly may never celebrate Christmas again if it's left to my own accord as far as decorating and all of that. I never was really a fan of the whole faff of it, and certainly I understand if children are involved it's a different situation, but when it's legitimately just going to be a bunch of adults, you know, putting up fairy lights, Christmas lights around the house, unless that's year round and you can get more value out of it, I don't think that's worth it. Putting up a Christmas tree is not worth it unless, again, you're going to do that year round, which if you're going to do that, then sure, okay. At that point, then it just becomes decorating. But any holiday, whether it's Thanksgiving, Christmas, Halloween, all of those things just take a lot of extra work. And if that's your passion, that's fine, but it's just not my passion. So the whole decorating aspect is ridiculous. Particularly on Christmas too, the whole gift giving aspect is also fairly ridiculous in that it is a competition you can really only fail for a lot of people as far as trying to find that perfect gift that would be really appreciated by the other person, when that's just not how it's gonna go. Best case scenario, you'll give a gift to a little kid. They'll be super excited about it for a few hours on Christmas Day, maybe a couple days, maybe even a couple weeks, but then, like most human beings, they get bored and they move on, and so that's just about that. Meanwhile, the possibility of failure in gift giving is extremely high. I saw one post on Reddit where a mother-in-law literally gave a toilet brush scrubber as a gift to the daughter-in-law, which is straight up just passive aggressive and insulting in almost every scenario, unless that was something she really asked for, and it was not the case apparently there. Even a husband giving like toilet cleaning supplies on Christmas is not acceptable as far as the gift goes. But yeah, a lot of times you'll get items, coffee makers when you don't drink coffee, things like that. And then you also run into the problem of gift cards, which are scams in themselves, in that there's large amounts of money that are always left on gift cards, and you don't really get any of the credit of being thoughtful when you're just giving cash. And frankly, you should just give real cash if you're going to give cash, but even real cash in today's day and world is not that helpful, at least in the United States, where almost everything is done via charge card, debit card, credit card. Interesting, VTuber Studio has popped up into the 99th spot. So yeah, there's a lot as far as the non-secular Christmas aspects that are a lot of faff, not worth it. Now if you have a deeply held religious belief around Christmas and you're doing the religious stuff, well then, good news. For the most part, that is exactly the same as it has been for 100 years and all of that. So, and yes, while that is extra effort and faff, I would assume your deeply held religious belief would have you overlook that. So yeah, I've never really been a huge fan of most holidays. Christmas in particular being the one that most people are overly fans of and spend way too much time on it. And in a lot of ways it's too dangerously close to being in school and then having the autistic child talk to you about his favorite rocks when they don't have the social skills to realize you have no interest in rocks or comic books or whatever fandom that kids often were super obsessive about, and they would want to talk about Pokemon, things like that. So yeah, there's my jolly Christmas spiel. But that does point me out that since I'm not going to do anything this Christmas, I think I might actually do some more video game YouTube related stuff today. We may do a follow list cleanup since there's going to be very little news today anyways. Yeah, and I could see myself just making video game content anyways, and going back to like Borderlands the pre-sequel and playing more of that. I don't see myself specifically trying to schedule videos, which is still up in the air as far as when am I going to start really scheduling new videos and releasing new videos. I could do shorts and have that automated. My macro today, again, broken. It seems very much the case that just whenever there is an update in Firefox, it tends to just have a high percentage chance of breaking how my macros run. And really at this point I just want them to work until I can build a new Linux computer that will move everything over. I really want to just put this current Windows 10 PC, which is popping up ads to get ready to transition to Windows 11, even though it's not compatible with Windows 11. Yeah, I just want to put it in stasis. Marvel Rivals, still doing good. And the numbers still seem fairly high for the last 24 hours. I mean, that would have been Christmas Eve, and it does seem like gamers are finding time to still play. Yeah, I have no idea what the state really of most people's Christmas Eve and Christmas experiences are even these days. Who knows? There could be so much disjointedness amongst families these days that Christmas is very different from like when I was a kid, which is really where my formation of my opinions come from more than recent years. So yeah, there's not a lot to say as far as the SteamDB 24-hour concurrent chart. It's still about the same. My chart is definitely on the slower side of updating and very slow to update since it's taking very long-term view, and so I doubt it is going to change. As far as what I've been doing other than just cleaning house and decluttering and trying to organize things, I've watched a lot more of the yet another fantasy anime on Hulu that was the I maxed out my defense anime series. It's a long title, but it's something like I didn't want to get hurt, so I maxed out my defense, which is funny because in the real world there's one like real world scene in the show where the main protagonist actually does get hurt, and there is a scene fairly deep into the first season or so, where she actually does get hurt, and there's actually several times where she actually does get hurt, and it's not like she overreacts to it or reacts to it at all. It's not the case that she just like immediately bursts into tears like you might expect, getting hurt or seeing her HP in the video game go down, and it's just not the case. Which I could see that happening as a joke at least the first time, is that as to why she would have the desire just to max out the defense and the vitality. It's really the vitality of the game she maxed out, not a defense stat. So yeah, I'm still enjoying that, but it still is running into, particularly this anime, it's running into a problem where it goes into sections where it skips big chunks of the grind that you would have in a real RPG game. And while I don't love grind, it is kind of crazy to say a month later, a week later, and just kind of skip things completely. And clearly these shows were designed to appeal to people who had already spent a lot of time playing JRPGs in particular and grinding a lot. And clearly the turning it into an anime does not transition and translate perfectly over, because you really are just not fighting enough small trash characters. Instead, every fight is a boss fight effectively that's being shown. I also watched the Japanese live action version of Death Note on Amazon Prime, which tells almost the exact same story as the anime. Clearly it's not the Netflix, it's not anything like the Netflix American Western live action, which is just a completely different story, where they crammed the concept of the Death Note into it very poorly. But it does, the Japanese live action one does perhaps get rid of some of the ridiculousness, smooth over some aspects, introduce characters a little bit earlier, so it feels like it's slightly more of a cohesive thing. There are definitely key points that they tease like it's going to play out exactly the same way, and then there is a twist, so that there really is a reason to watch the live action if you'd watched the anime, because then something slightly different happens. But slight spoilers for the show, everything kind of just ends the same way anyways. Like, it's not a case where the story is way different or one character dies instead of another. It all kind of goes exactly the same way, and it all ends the same way. And every time I watch Death Note, I always have that thought in the back of my head where I would like to see a tailing more of what would happen had Light really succeeded or gotten at least a lot closer to his goal of creating his ideal perfect world where there were no crimes, as childish as that thought may have been, because even in the live action, even in the anime version, it's always kind of a rushed bad ending. It's not like L or Nier or Mello, any of the so-called good guys in the story. The prove a point. Like they miss the plot as far as proving Light wrong in what he's doing, and they don't convince Light to change his ways or give up the Death Note. They just catch him. So the whole concept that I would like to see them play with more would be, can you prove why Light is morally wrong, which you can if you write the story pretty well and convince him that he's morally wrong, instead of just turning it into a cat and mouse chase series, which is what it really turned into. Like, I definitely would have preferred to see somebody take on that same concept and get it a lot further. Get to the point where Kira is given some kind of governmental authority and then has to manage and maintain the world he's trying to create. See where people are going to challenge him and how is he going to deal with that. Have him have some kind of internal rule set or conflict as to why he can't just kill anyone who slightly annoys him, which inherently, particularly in watching the live action Death Note series, and having watched the anime series a couple times too, there are clear points where Kira, L, I mean Light, not L, could have done something different and could have succeeded, either from a pragmatic point, or from just a more mature point of sticking to focusing on his ideals. The very first appearance of L, where L tricks Kira into killing a stand-in person who was pretending to be L, is clearly where the story could diverge very easily, because you could have simply at that point put out a announcement to the press a couple days later after not killing the stand-in, saying Kira does not kill people just because they irritate him. I only kill criminals, and to my knowledge, I only kill the criminals that are the most evil, and this person, L, is not the most evil. I'm simply going to ignore L. Had he simply ignored L at that point, the story would have drastically changed. Had it somehow still turned around to the point where his own father was on the task force with L to kill him, you could have been very practical very early. As soon as you realized you could control the actions of people before they die with the Death Note, you could have simply sacrificed your father, who ends up dying in the way the story actually goes anyways, and had him shoot L. In fact, there's many scenarios where you knew the names and faces of people who very practically could have gotten close to L and shot him. There's even a point in the live action series where instead of using the Death Note to kill L, he could have pretty much just beaten L to death, which, you could have done that too. Like, as soon as you got close, he showed up in the tennis match sequence, which is very ridiculous, and they did recreate it somewhat in the live action. In that sequence alone, you could have gotten him somewhere and just beaten him to death. That's the practical, pragmatic aspect. But by getting goaded into this personal game between L and the other detectives and Light, Kira, the whole story just gets away from his initial desire and his initial goal. Yeah, they don't really do anything different with the main story, which, yeah, it would be interesting, certainly, if had they done something different. Had him win and just ended the series there would have been certainly interesting. And that's certainly something the Netflix Western one could have done too, is had him win more than he really did, which the Western one did have him win. Is important, certainly, when watching Death Note 2, that it is being built around a very Japanese mentality that someone accused of a crime is 100% guilty, and that criminals should just be executed in general. There is very possibly a more interesting story to be told to just start 10, 20, 100 years in the future after a character like Kira showed up and see what that world was like. Or to hand the death note to somebody completely different who decides to go in a completely different direction. I've been checking out a new YouTube channel called Sex Positive Gaming, which it's interesting that they have like 40,000 subscribers and they're still on YouTube, and it'll be interesting to see how monetized they really are and how often they I really jumped from one topic to the other there, didn't I? It'll be interesting to see how in detailed a YouTuber can be and how successful they can be. But they definitely were saying that people on Patreon, which seems to be where a lot of the adult games are getting their support, is that they're doing seasons of content, or they're slowly developing their game, very slowly it seems like, through having Patreon supporters. But it does seem like the number of supporters has dropped quite a bit this year, which can't really directly connect to the lack of other games being released, but you can certainly directly connect it to just people being broke or just not being that into games of any kind. Plus, almost certainly, they point out that Patreon is going to just increasingly not want projects that end up having adult games as their final product or being related to adult games. And certainly that is more of the 3D CGI type games like this Lustrip game that would be on Patreon. Almost certainly none of the Japanese flat 2D adult games are going to be on Patreon. But yeah, end of the year is kind of a great time, it feels like, this year at least, to focus on finding some new YouTube channels, content creators, and having more game reviews. Particularly since there's not going to be too much of anything else. I'm a little surprised this game is even still on sale after the major success of Marvel Rivals, but I imagine that is just a completely different game. Did see a review for this one, so I want to check that out. Did I watch anything else? I wonder. There's a lot of time, certainly, where I am spending a lot of time these days just watching TV. A lot of that has to do with the fact that moving stuff around is hurting my knee and making me tired very quickly. I did watch a video where Second Wind, which used to be a lot of people from The Escapist, all played Viscera Cleanup Detail, which with a Santa Claus themed room, which was very pointless and a waste of time to watch. They weren't very good at playing the game. They really didn't care that they were playing the game, and it definitely was this just weird, let's all do this to make content type experience. Yeah, I probably did watch some kind of movie or fast forward through some kind of movie. I still am doing a lot of that too, where I'm fast forwarding through a lot of stuff. One of the things that's kind of a sad statement, though, I guess it's worth pointing out that once I get my house more organized, I definitely have like a whole new theater room ready to set up, and I could be watching, even streaming things in much better surround sound quality, if that helps any. Although, frankly, watching a lot of this on Hulu and having it always darken the screen whenever there's a flashy attack animation is really making it a terrible experience anyways. And yes, I know physical media is dying, but I definitely do want to hopefully be able to afford to grab the last few box sets, perhaps the last iteration of Ghost in the Shell, for instance, since that movie has been released multiple times in multiple formats, all the way back to, I believe, Laserdisc and VHS. So getting a new UHD 4K remaster of that would be nice. But yeah, there's room for a better experience there on a better TV, bigger TV, better surround sound. Of course, I need to get the room cleaned up and set out. Another thing that I noticed as far as the sex positive gaming games that they were talking about, they really were talking about older games that have been out for several years or been in beta for several years. They also use an interesting phrase that I might pick up and start using, calling fetishes flavors. So if you're into blondes, they would call that like a blonde flavor, or they would talk more generically and call it a flavor instead of, say, blonde fetish, big boob fetish, things like that. Although using coded terminology like that is not going to help passing the information along to people outside to know. Alright, well, yeah, this was one I saw that was reviewed, and it is already overwhelmingly positive, so I'll put that on the wish list. I thought about doing a wish list cleanup instead of a fall list cleanup today, but I mean, it's kind of pointless to do a wish list cleanup at all, particularly if it's a sale is not going on that I'm actually willing to spend money on, which I'm not at that point. So we'll go through the news and all the new games that come out on Steam, but there really isn't going to be much. And as I suspected, Christmas is not going to be the time in which new things come out. I did see one YouTuber's channel got hacked, which I feel like last year I saw at least one channel also get hacked. So it does seem like there is a kind of standard method of operating, in that someone gets their channel hacked perhaps months earlier, and then it seems like they secretly upload videos to that channel in some way that people can't see that videos they didn't create are getting uploaded, and then right on Christmas, on December 25th, they switch over the channel's title, the name, they start a live stream that is pumping some kind of scam Bitcoin launch, usually, or cryptocurrency launch of some sort, and then they start to often hide the original videos that were on the channel and just make it seem like it's a completely different channel. And I think there is probably a flaw on YouTube that if you have a live stream going, the channel won't be deleted until the live stream stops, and they figured that out, so they do these live streams as long as possible. Potentially, I think live streams can be well over 24 hours long if you want them to go that long. But it is kind of ridiculous that they do it on December 25th. I doubt very many people are going to be watching YouTube on December 25th. Real content creators aren't putting out much around December 25th. They tend not to put out much on any holidays. So maybe you'll get like a Merry Christmas type thing, or you'll get a rehash of a marathon of something, which is something that has been occurring more often on YouTube lately, as you see like Good Mythical Morning just combining several previous videos into long stream videos. So apparently that is working more, which that's kind of nice. My videos tend to be fairly long as far as my long plays, so if all of a sudden we are training an audience to watch 3, 4, 5, 6 hour streams, then there is something to that. Even if that is just a rehash, I still don't know how I would break up my episodes to start off to be like 30 minutes long and then combine them into longer streams. And they're not using the playlist function to do that. They're still just merging all the videos together. I imagine you have to be a fairly big channel for that to work too. But yeah, nobody's really going to put out a lot of content. And particularly around Christmas, I don't even know what kind of content you would do. I guess if you were a big enough channel, maybe you could do a giveaway of some sort. But yeah, I don't know what you really would do there. Christmas is still kind of more for the family and for local activities. I don't know how you really translate that. Let's see. Might be something funny if you could make like a screensaver that just throws all of your videos into a U-log file. That would be an interesting gimmick. Recutting all of your footage so it's just constantly every episode that came out that season just being thrown into the fire. Or just putting like a fire effect over your footage previously. Yeah. Doing like a long U-log live stream. Something like that could be a funny little gimmick. It still probably wouldn't do much though. Anyway, so I have 4 Video Games Chronicle articles. The Epic Games Store is still giving away games. Latest giveaway is Darker and Darker for 24 hours. I think that's the latest game anyways. Sonic 3 has outpaced Mufasa the Lion King in North American box office sales, which is Mufasa the Lion King even in theaters, or are they comparing it to yeah, okay. This means absolutely nothing to me because while I probably believed and knew that Sonic the Hedgehog 3 was in theaters, I didn't even know Mufasa the Lion King was in theaters or was even a movie. This may be an example how far from grace Disney has fallen from being in competition with Paramount and Sony. I think Sony's involved, but let's just go with Paramount. I don't even know if Mufasa the Lion King is a live action movie. I do feel like we are probably at the last point which Disney is going to try and make live action remakes of their previous movies, but it is kind of crazy that they aren't trying to remake the animated movies with different styles, or even really cheaply just use AI generated art to remake and effectively just rotoscope the previous movies. Because yeah, you could do that fairly cheaply too. Disney has been long since smoothing over and reanimating and remastering some of their older movies to the point where it has lost the details that it should have. And there are definitely some videos on YouTube that you can see to compare that, where you have things like Cinderella's dress now is this kind of very smooth, soft, almost CGI looking image, where the original Cinderella had sparkles and folds in the dress, and there's just pencil lines and all of that. And so they've been kind of maybe making it a little bit more colorful, expanding the color gamut, making it brighter, more cartoony that way, but they've also been just upscaling and smoothing in the worst possible ways. Here's kind of a good example of that, where there really should be like individual fur you could see all within the forehead of Sonic here, much like you can see kind of on the edge here, and it's really not enough when you get into the details of it, and it becomes more just solid blobs of color in many sections. And this is a brand new, almost certainly CGI animation, although this may be a still trailer image that was hand painted. But that's not really what I think Disney should do. I think what Disney should do is have straight up completely different art styles, rotoscoping it, different color palettes, different art styles. There aren't a lot of famous animators that most people know, but there certainly could be more of that. Or Disney should just not touch it at all, their old stuff at all, and instead focus on new stuff like Moana 2, which they are doing a lot of that, but they're not making enough. Really, if Disney had basically fired all of their animators, we should be getting a new Disney movie every 2 or 3 months at maximum. Disney should just be the animation company that has a new movie in theater, or at least cartoons and shorts in theaters, coming out extremely consistently, to the point where you would have curated an audience that were willing to go to the movie theater that often. Whereas now we are at the death of movie theaters, and people maybe are going to one movie a year at most. And that often is just the next Sonic movie, or the next horror movie, or the next Barbieheimer, if you happen to have something like that happen, which really only is going to happen once in a blue moon. But yeah, Disney is screwed up completely as far as how they run their movies and their videos and their animation budget. They're not doing, I think, particularly well with Disney TV as a streaming service, which could be a lot better and still could be a success. Like, I could see Disney promoting and making more movies that release day and date at Disney Plus, and that is their focus, and maybe they could go even a little bit lower budget on making animated movies, because they're just releasing it to their own streaming service instead of having to prepare it at a high resolution to be in the theater, although that probably is the exact same cost. Releasing around Christmas a movie is not the worst thought for kids movies, but it's probably not the best thought also. And yeah, Sonic seems to still succeed a little bit more these days in a movie than he does in video games consistently. Let's see. Call of Duty World at War and Singularity are reportedly coming to Game Pass. For a second there, I thought this was a crossover with the game Singularity, and I was like, that would be weird, considering how Singularity is this old game that nobody really has a need to talk about. And I don't think that we're going to see more of that. I think both games might be Activision Blizzard games anyway, so this may just be the slow rollout of more Activision Blizzard games just coming to Game Pass. Which you would think, after spending all that money to acquire Activision Blizzard, you would have seen them promote and push the idea that more games, better games are on Game Pass, and promote Game Pass a lot more. But they don't seem to really be doing a great job with that sales pitch either. I kind of want to do some research here to see if Bobby Kotick is still working at Activision Blizzard. I think he still is. I think it would have been big news had he left, and he definitely was still in charge of Activision Blizzard last year, and so it would have been kind of even end of the year news. People would have been dancing on his grave had he actually left Activision Blizzard. He may not be doing much, but I think he may still own a seat on the board, still may be the president. It definitely doesn't seem like anything big has changed there. Which again, I very much did wonder during that whole merger, which that really should be end of the year big news, and people aren't really talking about it. But during that whole merger attempt, as it was going through, I did wonder if this wasn't just rich people protecting other rich people. And it definitely feels like that is really what the acquisition by Microsoft of Activision Blizzard really was to protect Bobby Kotick, who was universally disliked in the game industry, and keeping him employed and getting golden parachute type jobs. Meanwhile, the only argument in my mind to keep Bobby Kotick around is that he might be very good at making other acquaintances, sitting on boards of other companies, and knowing and rubbing elbows with politicians, which I haven't seen him really accomplish anything there, although almost all of that is done in backroom deals. But that is the one reason to keep him around, is that he might be very good at having relationships and maintaining relationships that would keep people like the FTC off the back of Microsoft, although that didn't work out clearly. I wonder how many CEOs and upper management people are like Bobby Kotick, and maybe are just being employed because of who they know, and being kept around because of who they know. With the new US presidency administration coming in, there could be quite a lot of people in a lot of industries, but specifically in the game industry, who are maintaining power or gaining power simply because they might have connections to people who might be more rich and more powerful. And then, yeah, the only other thing is a Merry Christmas from Video Game Chronicles, which they are committing to not really posting any news until January. So we are just in a dead zone, effectively, from December 25th to December 31st, as far as any news from Video Games Chronicles, which means while I still probably will stream on Friday, it may very well be a very short stream, like today is probably going to be. And that just brings us to the Gematsu articles, which I had to hand open all of this because my macros didn't work, and I think for the most part that means most of these games news things are old. Although Dread Out Remaster Collection launching January 16th sounds to be new. Do we have a link to Steam before I click on the video and just watch that. Apparently not. Now I do recognize the name Dreadout, but that's about as much as I can say about it. Okay, it's a 3D Japanese horror series. It seems like you are using your cell phone as a flashlight and perhaps to take pictures of ghosts to defeat them, which that as a concept is not the worst concept ever, because it forces the player to face monsters while not really empowering them to shoot monsters with like a gun or something. I wonder what something like the Supernatural TV series would have been like had they had just some kind of pictures that they had to take of ghosts instead of just being able to shoot shotgun shells full of salt at ghosts or swing iron bars through them. Yeah, although in Supernatural, fairly quickly they were fighting other things than ghosts and monsters, but it all really did come down to them shooting guns. But I guess the Supernatural series never really was trying to be horrific or instill a feeling of horror as much as it was just trying to be a Monster of the Week show that would appeal to a much older audience, which it did succeed at that. It would be much more like something like Charmed if they weren't using guns, where they would have to cast some kind of spell or incantation. Moving on, Success Corp announces a mystery visual novel called Ghost Traveler Adventures in the Edo for Switch and PC. Interesting. And there really is no point in not watching just every trailer here, other than content ID reasons. I still have not figured out how you make content around visual novels, particularly since a lot of visual novel companies are not happy around content creators, at least in Japan, just having the entirety of visual novels spoiled on streams, particularly since a lot of visual novels are also kinetic and there's just no branching as far as how the story goes. There's no scoring or anything like that. Suppose you could take every single visual novel and apply a score system of just how fast can you read and like time to complete and speedrunning concepts like that, although I don't think they really want to encourage people to try and speedrun visual novels instead of reading at a comfortable pace and absorbing all of the information as well as possible. It is also certainly, as a United Statesian Westerner, more difficult to try and cover a game like this set in the Edo period, having not really a lot of knowledge around the Edo period. It does seem like the protagonist here is from modern Japan and is sent back in time. So that might help a little bit. But yeah, even a trailer like that not doing an amazing job of convincing me that this is one of the few visual novels I might actually want to play. The World According to Girl is coming to the PS4 and 5 on December 25th. It is a roguelike deck building currently available for the Xbox, Switch, and PC. it's interesting that we're still seeing these patterns of a lot of PC first, Switch first Japanese games, then slowly, whenever they get around to it, PS4, PS5 launches. There is still very much a case where the PlayStation, which once would have been the default console to release games on, is getting snubbed, but particularly by Japanese developers, due to it just being more difficult to deal with Sony than it really should be. Sony really should just have a two-tier attack as far as trying to get games on their console, which they definitely need, in that they should be fairly hands-off and easy to deal with for any small independent things, just trying to really flesh out mostly what would be PlayStation Network games. Meanwhile, their main focus should be to just have their AAA games flood the ecostructure so that there's just a ton of really good AAA games to play. I actually saw a commercial on Prime Video for Sony PlayStation, and it again was just one of these commercials that is just showing off the PlayStation buttons. That's pretty much it, and the general idea of video games. They don't even have like specific video games to advertise, and the fact that I saw that commercial and haven't seen any individual commercial for any individual games on Prime Video, I think really speaks to the idea of how Sony is right now spending its focus on promoting buying a PlayStation just because it expects you to own a PlayStation way more than it's trying to push the idea that there's a reason you should buy a PlayStation. Like, really, if Astrobot just won Game of the Year awards from several different competitions, we should be seeing a lot more advertisements for Astrobot. And it is kind of funny how when a game is proven to be successful, you don't see much of an extra push to promote that game. Whereas if I was a game developer, I definitely would want my publisher to say, hey, this game just won a bunch of awards. Let's at least do a small round of commercials and ads putting Game of the Year winner out there, and maybe that comes later, but it definitely feels like that you don't get that extra advertisement, and that there's just this assumption that the Game Awards in particular is the advertisement for people who win Game of the Year, and that is good enough. But the Game Awards are hard to even sit through, let alone I think a lot of gamers aren't going to have seen that, or they won't remember it amongst the tons of new advertisements. And certainly that was another YouTuber's criticism I saw, is how the Game Awards are almost 100% focused on what is coming out new and next, and very unfocused around talking about things that have come out and promoting that, which definitely smacks in the face of how most PC gamers play. Most people on Steam play games. Like, the vast majority, I think it was somewhere around, well, it wasn't quite the majority, but somewhere around like 37% of gamers are playing games that are at least a year old on Steam. So yeah, there aren't a lot of early adopters out there. And there are definitely a lot of people that are playing games that are nearly 10 years old or much older. Yeah, after watching this trailer, The World According to Girl, I can't say I particularly love that animation style though. We do have a Famitsu review score, which for issue 1880, I imagine Famitsu doesn't stop releasing issues just because of Christmas. Christmas certainly not that big of a deal in Japan, although they do like to get their KFC and have some chicken on Christmas Day, I think. I'm not sure that they even have a national holiday in Japan on December 25th. So they've given Infinity Nikki. Is that really how it's labeled? I thought it was Infinite Nikki. Maybe the mobile game is called Infinite and maybe the console is called Infinity Nikki. 34 out of 40, which is pretty good average. Path of Exile 2 only getting 33 out of 40. And Stray Children for the Switch getting 32. So 34, 33, 32. Speaking of Nikki, or Nike, in a move that should surprise basically nobody, there is going to be a collaboration between Nike Goddess of Victory, the mobile kind of lewd, well, fairly lewd game from Shift Up, and Stellar Blade, the fairly nude PlayStation or AAA game from Shift Up. So, and clearly that's free advertising, as it were, to have a collab. So no big surprise there. I would suspect it is going to be mostly a one-way thing, in which Stellar Blade's character Eve will show up in a 2D, live 2D animated form in Nike Goddess of Victory, not to be confused with Infinity Nike. But if there is a crossover into Stellar Blade from Nike Goddess of Victory, I imagine it will just be outfits or characters, probably just outfits that get transferred over. I don't think they're going to bother to make new 3D models and new characters for Stellar Blade. I don't think there was a real thought that Stellar Blade was going to have any kind of DLC or expansion of major content. In a lot of ways, being the first 3D game made by Shift Up, I imagine they've learned a lot of lessons, and they will just want to move on to the next game. And hopefully one of the lessons they learned is to maybe have a little bit better dialogue writing and a little bit better storytelling, and not just be what is effectively very easy to claim a ripoff of Nier Automata, which, yeah, it's hard, even as somebody who would want to play Stellar Blade and cover it, it's really hard for me to say I need to play Stellar Blade right now when I haven't even gotten around to playing Nier Automata. And if I start playing Nier Automata, then it's hard to make an argument that I shouldn't play one of the other Nier games. Which then that's a big commitment before you even get to Stellar Blade. So big of a commitment that the next Shift Up game may already be out by the time I got around to playing Nier Automata and possibly the other Nier game, one of the other Nier games. Nier weird in that there's a Japanese version of the first game and an English version of the first game that are different, and then there's a re-release of the first game that changes things a little bit too, so you'd have to kind of pick. Probably just pick the remake is your best bet. And this is an older story, but I did hear different speculation around this. We still don't really have any details. This Terminator 2D title, I took it to think that this was potentially going to be a VR game, like that was going to be converted down into 2D, but it is also probably more likely that it is actually just a 2D flatter style of game, maybe like a beat 'em up or something, although that doesn't make a lot of sense as far as a Terminator game. Terminator in general is a gun game, so having a 2D gun game doesn't make a lot of sense. But yeah, this art style, potentially, if this is even a screenshot from Terminator 2D No Fate, would imply that it might be more of a 2D experience. There has been several instances, certainly though, where we've had Australian rated games that leak out games are coming, and then it just doesn't seem like it's very fast for those games to really come out and be released, if they ever get released. So who knows. Clearly, if this was a game that was going to come worldwide and that they were going to promote, you would think that they would promote it more. And certainly would be weird if it only got released in Australia. Then we could bring Gaming on Linux articles up, and I have about 5 of those. One of the things, certainly, I guess you can say about Christmas too, as I'm hearing people honking a horn outside, is that, yeah, once you just have that whole situation where people are doing things, going places, and just dealing with family, I do tend to see that there's a lot more doors slamming and cars honking, car horns honking and things like that. Yeah, my grass doesn't look particularly good looking at my cameras, but it is the dead of winter, so it's not that bad. So yeah, a bunch of car honking. Seems like neighbors just had a bunch of visitors show up. Getting things delivered around Christmas is also a nightmare. Yeah, even if you're just trying to order groceries, it turns into a nightmare. I failed to really stock up like I should have this year. I should have gotten it close to December 1st. Had a month and a half worth of food delivered, something like that. So Valve released the Best of Steam 2024, showing off the highest earners and most played games. The question here is, can I find the link? Because Gaming on Linux is narrowing it down to just Steam Deck top most played games, which, okay, and then overall most played games, and a nice list here. But I imagine for that kind of article, this going to Valve, going to Steam makes a lot more sense. Now, they intentionally obfuscate things in that they put things as platinum. By the way, I got all the stickers from the Steam sale, if anybody's concerned about that too. But yeah, they put all the top sellers as platinum and not really are giving out any numbers as far as maybe Dota sold thousands less than Helldivers 2, but they're still within a certain range. Then clearly there's a certain range here of gold. For all we know, perhaps there's some paid placement also happening here. We just aren't really being shown any rules or reason to anything like that. And then certainly there's going to be a difference between a free-to-play game like Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel, which would be either played a lot or earn a lot, versus Call of Duty Modern Warfare, which is a pay to start, and at the very least it may have not that much microtransactions, although a lot of these games definitely do, I think, have microtransactions in them. And so they very well can be on that silver list because of just microtransactions. And then you have like Persona 3 Reload, which is very much late to the party as far as people who would love Persona 3. Particularly now, since it does feel like Metaphor ReFantasio can just be a nice replacement for the Persona series. Here's the supermarket simulator that Game Grumps are covering and playing a ton of. And certainly a lot of clones of that type of game, some of which have succeeded fairly well. And I don't think there'd be anything super surprising. It is kind of interesting that you have mostly negative games like Overwatch 2, for instance, still having a player base. Revenue specifics are not disclosed for each game, so they're grouped them together in buckets. The games within each buckets are randomly sorted. So the 1st through 12th games, as far as making the most sales, are platinum. The 13th through 24th games. So this does give you the top 100 best sellers under the top sellers. But then if you go to new releases, these are the best selling games in 2024. If you go to most played, that's that. There's apparently supposed to be an early access graduates, but I don't even see that as far as what's up here. In fact, yeah, just jumps straight to Steam Deck and then controller friendly and top VR. And clearly there is a focus here as far as trying to promote the Steam Deck and VR, where one is almost certainly a better idea to promote otherwise. So yeah, the chart changes slightly when you have new releases, in that it's taking out some of the older games, although new releases is fairly subjective too, in that it's new releases to Steam, not new releases of games in general. If I was wise and had a lot of money and time, I should play the Kingdom Hearts series. I've had major success in the past playing the Lego kids games, so it would make a lot of sense to play Kingdom Hearts and attract that slightly younger audience once again. So that's your top 100 in buckets as far as new releases and their sales numbers. Most of these games, to my knowledge, have not put out sales numbers and won't put out sales numbers as far as just how many units were even sold. None of them really go through the effort of putting out the total amount of income a specific game has gotten because of sales, confusing that quite a bit. And it certainly is potentially more relevant to just look at the most played games. And in a funny way, I suppose this is not too different from my chart, other than the fact that my chart is giving specific numbers and they are being less specific here. Clearly, though, my chart is not as pretty as the Valve's page can look. It would be way too much work to try to do that, to make it look as nice as this. And frankly, I'm just not. Let's see if we can really figure this out. Yes, having looked at my chart and made it, let's see if there are any surprises here. PUBG, I think, is probably a little bit lower. But the rest of these games are unsurprising in the over 450,000 peak players. Although, it is also worth pointing out that this is looking for the all-time peak throughout the year. So, on day one launch, something like Space Marine might have gotten over 200,000 peak players, but then day 2 it may very well have gotten only 10,000 players, and it may very well be the case that every day after that it only got about 10,000 concurrent peak players, which makes it not particularly that relevant. It just means that there was a lot of hype and a lot of people playing that day 1, and this chart is not accounting for that, where my chart would account for that and put over a much broader over time view on the thing, on how relevant a game is. It does definitely feel like something like content warning, for instance, may very well not be that relevant. Although streamers probably are playing that and bumping up the player base because of that. And then there is also an argument that you may very well have just a locked-in audience playing GTA 5 that will just always play GTA 5, and at a certain point that audience is just not representing the rest of the gaming community because they're not playing any other games and they're not really being varied enough. I watched a YouTuber's video covering Fallout 4, which, yeah, one thing I was surprised about that is it does seem like Fallout 4 has no real cap on its level system. So theoretically it feels like, unlike Fallout 3, unlike Fallout New Vegas, you can just continuously play Fallout 4. Now, the content in Fallout 4 may not be really good enough to do that, but it is interesting to see that there really isn't a level cap, which means you can potentially just play forever, and you can potentially, I think, get a lot more of the perks because of that. There still is probably not a way without a mod or cheat to get a full 10-10-10 on your special stats that you start the game with. Also, the VAT system in Fallout 4 seems to have been tweaked a little bit more, making it almost a completely different playstyle and possibly the best playstyle, whereas Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas both had the VAT system being almost mandatory and also fairly slow and uninteresting as a way to play as much as you would like it to be. Clearly there is a desire now for Fallout games to be first-person shooter games, first and foremost, and not slow turn-based games like the first two games. So over the 1,000 player peak, you start to see things like V Rising that really wouldn't have caught my attention as much, or I don't think I even remember Enshrouded. But then you might also have things that come and go very quickly, and then you clearly have a case where games like software like Wallpaper Engine are just completely mislabeled, and Valve should realize that and should take some actions there, because Wallpaper Engine, to my knowledge, is not a game at all. Yeah, it's tagged as software, and the reason its numbers and player base is so high is I imagine you have to run it to have a fancy wallpaper, and I suspect maybe a lot of streamers use it too. And then there's a fairly big difference between something that's been out since 2020, like Factorio, and Satisfactory, which may have been in beta since 2020 but came out in version 1.0. Yeah, you definitely don't get a reasoning as far as why certain games are getting a peak or higher player base. VR chat, same thing. They're not really a game, so it's kind of unfair to, 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 And as far as I can tell, this information is just exactly the same that SteamDB has, which would make a lot of sense. Metaphor Refantasio down here in the bronze, over 50,000 peak players. Although also kind of a single player game, so there really isn't a need for a ton of players. It's much worse that Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel has peaks of 50,000 players. And yeah, I have no idea whether fans of Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel are still sticking with the game. I doubt they're gaining a significant amount of new players. And yeah, they've definitely lost me as a player, just because they were taking way too long with their daily quest. And there is certainly a loss in that there's just not really a connection to the anime series in Master Duel. But I really think they should just hurry up and release some kind of rush style game. It just speeds up the process. Pokemon TCG Pocket really highlights how you can have a much better experience just by having a shorter game overall. It really only takes 3 or 4 minutes to play a game in TCG Pocket, which really makes me want to jump and play the next game, whereas the Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel is like 40 or 50 minutes to play one game, and that'd be fine if you were doing like a tournament type play, but for day-to-day daily quest, I really would want to spend less time. Here we have the Steam Deck chart, which is, I guess, a chart that SteamDB doesn't offer, and maybe we aren't quite at the point yet where there is going to be a real need to segregate and talk about the most played games on the Steam Deck on a day-to-day basis. And I don't know how we're going to really talk in those terms, because it has been, I think, officially confirmed now that there is going to be a new Lenovo Series S, I believe is what it's called, Steam Deck like device, where it is basically the Lenovo Go, I think, but it is going to have SteamOS built into it and a dedicated Steam button, and so the presentation I think is going to happen is that we're going to see a lot of these devices have different versions, and it is just going to be a case where if you buy the Steam version, you're going to get SteamOS. If you buy the Windows version, you're going to get Windows. And then there probably will be a process to switch over, but if you do so, it's probably going to void your warranty at that point. It may very well be the case too that Microsoft has just realized that they're so far away from having a portable device that, at least for a first generation, they should just partner up with Valve and Steam and just work to somehow get Xbox Game Pass involved on the SteamOS too. But yeah, there is a slight difference as I scroll down on the Steam Deck, and you have like Binding of Isaac Rebirth, which is from 2014, so we're now 10 years away from its release, which probably puts us closer to 25 or 30 years from the original Binding of Isaac game being released. That clearly is a game that would work fairly well on the Steam Deck and has almost infinite replayability. So while that game still has fairly high numbers, it's going to struggle to even be in the most played category, because I imagine its audience is fairly saturated. Things like Slay the Spire also. There is certainly a mentality here that I think Valve will eventually want to try and tackle, in that there is people with Steam Decks who want a smaller AA type experience with something like Binding of Isaac or Slay the Spire, and thus they are focusing in and playing those games, despite the fact that you have something from 2015 as a AAA game, still very playable on the Steam Deck and getting played, or Diablo 4, very playable, or even Black Myth Wukong being very playable. There is definitely the older AAA games in this gold section, not people trying to push the newest games with the highest graphics. In fact, that the only exception there really may be Cyberpunk 2077 in this first group. But yeah, there is at some point, I think, going to need to be a shift in mentality there, in that the Steam Deck would hopefully be capable of playing brand new launch games, and there would be much more parity between that. Yeah, and you can see like the Aperture Desk Job tech demo for the Steam Deck still getting played quite a bit in the silver category, which notice bronze here seems to be completely missing, and I don't know why that would be the case, unless I accidentally blocked it somehow. Let's see if that fixes that. Yeah, there's just no bronze even being mentioned here as far as the Steam Deck goes. We could go further into controllers. Unfortunately, I think I'm going to have to take a bathroom break, which I haven't had to do that fairly recently. But also, I'm not really surprised, and honestly I think it kind of helps in a weird way. Again, bronze for a controller not even being shown, so they're struggling to even find 100 games that they really want to promote as far as Steam Deck controller and VR are concerned, which at a certain point maybe you just shift everything down and don't have platinum as your starting point. And I basically have nothing to say about VR. Like, there's very much a case where I don't think I would ever bother to buy VR or try and play VR, particularly if I'm going to like Bazzite Linux as an operating system. I have no idea how that would really work, if that would really work. Yeah, I don't think that there's been any significant release of a VR game since Half-Life Alyx 4 years ago, really, and mostly it does just seem like it's the same old games. And yeah, I imagine they will just continuously promote VR, but they really won't get anywhere with it, and they don't, I suspect, really expect to get anywhere with it. Alright, well, so I'm gonna pause the recording and take a bathroom break, and I'll be back in about 20 minutes. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. Although if I am gonna do a flawless cleanup today as part of the stream, like, which maybe I will, maybe I won't. Probably gonna have another bathroom break at some point. As far as going on to the other Gaming on Linux news articles, Palworld Daybreak version 0.4.11 is out now, and it's a huge update. I think we had pretty much already talked about that, but since there isn't a lot of news today, it doesn't hurt to watch the trailer. I watched a YouTube video, so clearly I'm watching a ton of YouTube videos talking about how open world games really don't work, and using Witcher 3 is one of the examples, which is interesting because I wouldn't really think Witcher 3 is a huge example of where open world games don't work, but kind of I agree with the thought, certainly. Like the vast majority of the Witcher 3's main storyline content is what I did. Like there wasn't a lot of times where I would get super distracted and just run around the overworld. And the one time in which I did get super distracted and ran around in the overworld in Witcher 3 was when it was in that middle section where it's islands and a bunch of diving for barrels in the ocean, and I found that part to be particularly bad. But I also feel like in that section you also are just kind of running from main storyline quest to main storyline quest. So yeah, I kind of do agree that the open world concept, let's just watch this one too, is fairly flawed, increasingly so as we get more and more games that just can easily automatically generate open world terrain and can procedurally generate a lot of random encounters. I guess it comes down to people's own personal opinion when it comes down to Witcher 3, whether you should have been running into a lot more random monsters and that it shouldn't have felt so much like side quests. I really don't know what part of this feels like it's Terraria. Is it just a sword with the mouse? Is that the Terraria aspect here? I guess it is. But yeah. It did definitely feel like in Witcher 3 that you were there for that main story experience. And only the main story experience. Which is fine because that was the best content, and so then the open world aspect is really just perhaps slightly unnecessary content. But yeah, increasingly so, you're going to have a lot of games that are going to just have big flat empty or mostly empty open world sections. When you get into some of the JRPGs in particular, you have a lot of that. My own personal experience, having somewhat recently played Torchlight 2, there was a bunch of procedurally generated open world areas that, while you kind of needed that, also weren't rewarding me enough for what I was doing, nor was it randomly respawning enemies for me to want to stay in an area, which created the weird situation in Torchlight 2 where you almost certainly have to get the best out of it, play with multiple players or go through multiple playthroughs, and the main story content in Torchlight 2 is just not good enough to justify doing that. The open source evolution sim Thrive version 0.4 brings more graphical improvements and new game mechanics. I believe Thrive is probably trying to be a Sims outside of the Sims instead of perhaps a mod for Sims 4, which I certainly could see that. Of course, I could be completely wrong, and this could be more of a game of life game now that I actually start to see some screenshots of it. Yep, I was completely wrong there. Well, I do have a bit of a scientific intrigue on a game like this. I don't think I'd really want to play this. I think the concept itself is just a little bit over my head and a little bit more complicated than what I would really want to do. Yeah. Seems like you're effectively playing a space game, but instead of space being outer space, space is just the inner space of an ocean or a bloodstream or something like that. Yeah. And inherently, I've never been a huge fan on space games. And perhaps there's a reason for that, because space is inherently the ultimate open world environment where you can just fly in any direction and go anywhere, where very often in space games there's not a lot to do, or nothing to do. ScumVM version 2.9.0 is out for expanded retro gaming support, which inherently they have a long list here of games, none of which I think actually use the ScumVM engine. Maybe Backyard Baseball does, which that may be close to the last ScumVM game that isn't just 100% supported. And then there's a lot of games that are designed on different engines of the same era, like the AGS engine. And then Thimbleweed Park in particular is like almost a brand new game comparatively. But yeah. Increasingly, over a long enough period of time, I think the ScumVM emulator is just going to emulate all old games and eventually just smack directly into games that still are compatible either via Proton or Wine with Windows, or with Linux emulating Windows, more likely. Yep. And in the emulator wars, if emulators really were at war, we may see a point where SteamOS with Proton and emulation runs every old Windows game back to like Windows 95, original versions of Myst, just fine. And ScumVM runs any old, more DOS-based game just fine. And there probably will be a bit of overlap. Myst is an example of that, since some versions of Myst at least are run through ScumVM. And any other emulators will probably go by the wayside. Maybe their code can be added to ScumVM if it's needed. And gamers will be the beneficiaries of that, because there will be very few games that people actually want to play that would be unplayable at that time. Increasingly, I think even now, the games that people really want to play are already fairly playable. There isn't a lot of games that I can tell you the name of or think of that I absolutely know can't be played and would want to play them. At a certain point, it is also just academic. Though, when I look at this list, Thimbleweed Park is a newer game, so I could see making an exception there. And maybe I could highlight and make a quick look of Backyard Baseball. But the rest of these games I don't really recognize, and so I don't think I really would care to play them. At one point, I was ambitious and wanted to play like every single game that the ScumVM emulator could play and just do a lot more point-and-click games. But it's very hard when you kind of need your YouTube channel to succeed to cover point-and-click games that often. And certainly it's kind of hard to play point-and-click games when you really also have a desire to play newer, more controller-based games anyways. Proton 9.0-4 now brings big compatibility improvements for Steam Deck and Linux, specifically naming several games here. With the announcement happening in January, though, that more hardware is going to be supported with SteamOS, though, I can't help but wonder if these updates in particular are going to start to segment themselves a little bit more. We can notice here at the highlights here, Sniper Elite Nazi Zombie Army 2 is for AMD GPUs only, and Warhammer requires the Steam overlay to be disabled. So if all of a sudden we start to see Proton updates that says for the Steam Deck this has been improved, but for the Lenovo Legion Go or the ROG Ally this hasn't been improved. So you might see that kind of separation and segregation that is exactly what led in part to the downfall of Steam machines previously, is that there was just too much of a split there. And so it will be very interesting to see where this really falls as far as what rule set is Valve eventually going to have to either secretly tell its partners or publicly tell its partners, as far as no NVIDIA graphic cards, no Intel CPUs, no RISC-V strong arm type CPUs. It's got to be an x86 64 AMD CPU. It's got to have a minimum of 4 gigabytes of RAM at a certain speed. It's got to have a minimum of an AMD Radeon 2 graphics card in it. And there may very well be rules that they eventually decide they have to implement that says only these specific chips work. And we're not really going to expand it further and further. Now, Linux in general doesn't really require that, but the Proton compatibility aspect of it may require that. There may just be specific commands and code that only can be translated into certain hardware, or Valve is only going to be willing to translate to it. Inherently, Valve needs Asus and Lenovo and Microsoft to probably form an alliance or put a lot of money in to hire new employees or to have employees volunteer on code to make sure that Proton just expands itself to have specific patches for specific hardware way more often and just have a lot more improvement overall. That being said, I don't know if there's ever going to be a point where we're going to just have like Proton 9 or Proton 11 or Proton 12 released, and then that is going to be some significant improvement that just overnight increases the compatibility from 10,000 games to 20,000 games on SteamOS. There could be things like that, but more than likely, I think it is going to always just be these small incremental improvements, and then after there's enough small incremental improvements, they're just going to move over to the next major number version. It is also worth pointing out, though, that if Proton 9.0-4, which is probably a release candidate with the dash in it, that's a weirder way to have a number system. If they know that they fixed issues with these games, there's a decent chance that they may have fixed issues with other games. Lots of other games that they just haven't tested it on. Smaller games people are less interested in. That being said, it is also possible that they are putting in individual bits of code to detect specific games to act completely different based on those specific games, instead of overall just fixing it. And my speculation that NVIDIA graphics cards are not going to be allowed is not true at the moment. But yeah, I do think Steam Deck like machines may very eventually just say NVIDIA GPUs are not allowed. And if it's not said out loud, it may just be de facto true, since NVIDIA still is not open sourcing all of its code, microcode for its GPU drivers. Valve may be working on a new kind of Steam machine. This is probably an older story, and it's kind of been confirmed, but not 100% confirmed. You know, Valve almost certainly has partnered with Lenovo so that there's another Steam Deck type device that is portable. We have not gotten any confirmation that there is any kind of console-like device that just plugs into your TV. And yeah, that is more what you would call a Steam machine. And they may all already own the trademarks for Steam machine and things like that, so I wouldn't be surprised if they do call them Steam machines once again. But yeah, if any of this actually even gets announced at like CES, I question with it whether it still wouldn't be 6 months to a year before anything actually gets shipped and delivered. Even if it was announced at CES, most things announced at CES kind of disappear and never show up. So a Steam machine wouldn't be much different than that. In fact, it's a little bit weird to even see computers being announced at CES nowadays. I did see an interesting video where Technology Connections made an experimental connector for his garage space heater where he could plug in his car charger plug into the space heater and then take the power from the wall through the car charger plug, which gives them a longer cord and more control into the space heater. And it's not a terrible thought, really. Yes, there would need to be more technology than what he put in his space heater to just make it safe. And the one assumes that the plug length connected to the car charger plug is the right setup. So it should be safe to use in that connection. But in the United States, there tends to only really be enough wattage in your circuit breaker to have one 240 plug, which is almost exclusively going to be used for an electric dryer. And so you do run into this situation where you have to do costly electrical expansions and service changeouts and getting permits to add a second 240 plug to charge a car, or you have to buy a plug splitter and then never run your dryer at the same time. And I don't know if they even make plug splitters. So there is a thought there that, particularly within your garage, you could have a dryer that has the electric car charger plug in the front of it, and you would just unplug the plug from the wall, or unplug it from your car and plug it into your electric dryer at that point. And that makes as much sense as the space heater does. And so you would have to move this plug around into several different places, but that would be fairly smart. I could even see potentially plugging in a garage freezer into that, but that's more of a permanent plug-in situation, so you probably wouldn't do that. So it really would just be a garage heater, space heater, electric space heater, a garage clothes dryer, and your car is sharing that plug. And they could share that plug fairly nicely. Although, in reality, you could probably just make a technology where all three of those devices could just be hardwired in, and they could have priority relay switches over them. So when your car is plugged in, it turns off your dryer and it turns off the space heater. And you could do it that way, or just wired in completely. But it is an interesting thought, certainly, as a new standard. So that has nothing to do with video games, and that is a bit of a tangent, but it is an interesting thought that maybe next year at CES, probably not this year, you might start to see space heaters for garages that plug into a carport plug or electric dryers. Now, ideally, it would probably be better if you had gas dryers for your clothing dryers anyways, or the newest Samsung 2-in-1 device that I think really only runs off 120 in the United States anyways, that condensates and dries using 120 volts and getting away from 240 volts overall. And so as far as CES goes, I'd like to see some more news for the washer dryer combo machines, where you can just throw the clothes in, they'll get washed, then they'll automatically dry in the same barrel. Yes, that will take twice as long, if not longer, to do it, but it does mean you just have to set it and forget it until it's done, instead of having to move things over. I'd like to see more of those compete. I'd like to see that new technology be improved for better stability and warranties, and I'd like to see the price go down on those. But it certainly is also a technology that I imagine now, with potential tariffs, would not really be viable to purchase within the next 5 years, which I was thinking it was going to take at least 5 years before it really became a smart decision to purchase the 2-in-1 washer dryers anyways. But yeah, almost certainly the future is going that direction. Perhaps it is a case that if I take breaks, which I have to take breaks, I do get off track a little bit. I am noticing that. Although I didn't immediately start rambling, I only got off track because of CES announcements of potentially a new Steam machine. If a new Steam machine actually does if a new Steam machine actually does get announced at CES, there is also a possibility that we aren't really expecting to see too much of a improvement over the next few years in computer technology either. Yeah. So it probably will be locked in technology unless they just make something that's really underpowered. A Steam machine bought in the next year probably will be good enough for at least 4 years, very possibly much longer, particularly if Valve is going to try and stick to their commitment to not just put out a Steam Machine 2 concept the second there's small incremental improvements. I saw something on Reddit where they were doing a meme about how the graphics cards are still on 256 buses as far as how the data is transferred backwards and forwards. I'm not sure that the buses on PCI Express 5, though, being still 256-bit, is really saturating that 256-bit bus, so it very likely is not really a problem at all, or it's a problem that's been solved with VRAM or something else. I really haven't heard people legitimately complain about that too much. So yeah, and if anything, if graphics cards did go to 512-bit buses, that would really just mean there's more room for video games to try and render way too much and trying to push the graphics way too much, which as a gamer I'm not really interested in that happening. I think graphics look perfectly fine now, and just pushing it so the number goes up doesn't make sense, or pushing it so the resolution's so high that my eyes can't even tell a difference doesn't make sense. We talked about this fan-made PC port of Star Fox 64 being out now. I wanted to open the GitHub page, and apparently I'm not signed in, so I will try and follow this project. One thing I have recognized is because Bakelite Linux is designed in a very different way where it's just kind of constantly updating, I do get a lot of updates for new releases of Bakelite Linux over any other GitHub project that I follow. Inherently there's a lot of projects I do follow that don't update very often at all. Sorry, I'm losing my track here. So you have to have a specific US 1.1 ROM of Star Fox 64 to run this PC version. Then you have to verify that it's in the .z64 format. Then you can download Starship, and then you generate the one-time runnable from the ROM. I assume it's what OTR does. Copy the ROM to the root folder, and you extracted the zip into it. Then you just click a .bat file in Windows, and then you launch Starship EXE. Of course, you can enjoy that yourself, but the second you start trying to stream that, Nintendo's going to have a problem with that. So yeah, noticeably, nobody has gone out of their way to talk about a PC port effectively. And I guess this is a true port of Star Fox 64, and I bet they won't get back to it. A lot of people won't get back to reporting on that by the new year. And then GameDeveloper.com, maybe, I'm not even sure, has put out another staff picks. I feel like this Bryant Francis top 10 games of the year we already covered, and yeah, I don't think there's a lot of room for anything amazing to be talked about. 2024 in particular is just a terrible year, and so the end of the year content is extremely lightweight. And then Chris Care's top 5 games of the year, going from 10 down to 5, may be new as far as new news, but they too aren't going to have much to say. And you do get into a weird situation here where if I was going to do a top 10 games of the year, I might give Pokemon TCG Pocket a number 10 spot too, just because I'm playing a ton of it. But honestly, I don't feel like it's a very good game. There's just not a lot to do there. And in the same way that I would like Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel to have a Yu-Gi-Oh! Rush version where you can play it faster, there is an occasional time where I'd like there to be tournament play rules where you play the original Pokemon card game instead of this sped up version that they've created. And that's all I really have from GameDeveloper.com. So the next thing would be to just go through new games that came out on Steam, which some of these we probably have already looked at since I went back manually to December 22nd for a couple of them. But yeah, even that is not going to be that many games today that came out on Steam. Yeah. This is probably nothing, but I'll give it a chance. This one doesn't support English. We're still seeing some of that happen. fishing game. It's not visually polished enough though. And these are things we already covered. So yeah, we did go through all the 23rd stuff, or most of the 23rd stuff, which isn't super surprising because the 23rd would have been when we last streamed. Let's see, I think if I am going to do any follow-us cleanup today, which depends on when that wave of tiredness hits me, which, yeah, that is what usually kills me in these live streams, is that at some point I just run out of energy, and today has just been a shorter experience, so I think I may get lucky. This one says it supports English, so I question it. At a certain point, if you don't even have an English title on your English page, though, I'm gonna say no to it. I assume that was an English page. Yeah, my hope would be that if I do get to the point where I feel like doing some flawless cleanup, that I could run through it and find some low-hanging fruit. There is definitely a problem with the fall list, which they aren't really that interested in people using the fall list, and they definitely are not designing the fall list to handle hundreds, if not thousands, of games being followed by one user. But yeah, you can't just hover over a game and see a pop-up like you can on other pages. Which, if I could do that, I could stop following a lot of games just by very quickly recognizing the main factors, which is, has it been out for over 6 months? Is it mostly positive? And is it out of early access? Those are the main factors. And so if something is mixed or mostly negative, it can be immediately dismissed. If it's not been out long enough to be given a chance, it can be dismissed. Although there is almost a washing element here, that if something came out in November, I don't think that there's really a high chance somebody would go back and check out those games or see those games in January or February. I think once the new year hits, you do run into this situation where nobody is interested in the games after that. That might be something. I feel like I'm being fairly generous today, just knowing that there aren't that many games that are even going to be released. We're up to December 24th, and yeah, particularly on the 25th. And yeah, if you're a proper game publisher, you've got to be, you really need a very specific reason that you would release a game on December 12th, and something like the Exorcist game just makes no sense to be releasing that on the Christmas Eve or Christmas. Yeah, your game basically needs to be Christmas themed in some way. Riverside Gals here is definitely, I think, trying to be name confusion with Riverside Girls. these kind of hidden object puzzle games still make sense. And they're coming frequently, but not so frequently that they're super annoying. It seems like that audience has kind of dictated how often the 2 or 3 major publishers put out those kinds of games. And frankly, they put out so many of it, they probably do have the exact statistics as far as just how often can they put out a new game like that, or how often can they make a new game like that. I question really how many people really even play those games, or versus how much of those games are just so easy to make that people make them for really small numbers. Inherently, that is the unseen under the rock, under the belly of Steam, is that there either are a lot of people who are just crazy and put out games thinking it will make the money back, or there are just a lot of games that are super cheap to make and do get sales. Perhaps they get sales somewhere else. I don't think it's as big of a conspiracy as perhaps there are third-party websites that are giving away or gambling for Steam codes of games that are actively spending money to develop new low-cost games to have those Steam codes. That almost seems like that would make sense, but that is very conspiratorial, and I can't really believe that they would do that. If they were doing that, they would be the people making complete asset flip garbage games. Inherently, it costs at least $100 to sell a game on Steam, so if you were making a low effort asset flip game to get Steam codes to put it on a third-party Steam key gambling site, that would be a lot of work. And just like direct work, I imagine that the third-party Steam key gambling sites don't really have to deal with. Although inherently, I do think that is probably what funds a lot of the third-party Steam key gambling sites, is that they do have a lot of Steam keys for a lot of low-effort garbage games. But I wouldn't say the vast majority of games on Steam, maybe the slight majority of games on Steam, are low-effort garbage games. But yeah, it does feel like somebody here thinks that their product would succeed. There's clearly a lack of market research that Valve could stand in and give a bit of advice there. And yeah, they don't have to act like a third-party publisher that would want to take a cut or not want to support the development of a game just because it's only going to sell a little. But I do think an end of the year least popular games column or article would be very helpful for game developers to say, hey, look, we got this many games with this many tags and this many of them sold, and so games with this tag are the least popular, least ones to sell. Don't make games like this. I'm sure they don't want to really name and shame individual games, and Valve is making money from Steam Direct anyways for every garbage game that gets published, so it would be against their own profits to say that. But yeah, it definitely would help the game development community, and by helping the game development community, it would help the quality of games on their storefront. Yeah, Plus, if they did that, you can ignore the curation aspects more. You don't have to really curate at all then if you can just tell people that these types of games don't sell. So I'm just gonna scroll all the way up here. Here's my follow list. It did load, so at some point they maybe even improved their database, or maybe I've just gotten it down lower, and it wouldn't make a lot of sense to start at the top. But inherently, unlike other pages, there's not a pop-up that happens when you highlight I'm going to go ahead and stop following Ari and see how it's just not really responding very fast there. Yeah, that just crashed my macro program UI Vision. I clicked that, but it did seem like that may have worked. Anyways, let me go ahead and turn off another plugin I have. I could certainly say, hey, I'm just done with VR and do a follow list cleanup to get rid of that. But honestly, I think what I want to do, let's start with one thing. Let's drag this to its own window. That way anything I do here doesn't affect the YouTube shorts I just made as part of the normal way I stream. And we'll just go as far as we can go. Let's see. I kind of do want that there. So I'm going to turn the plugin I just turned off back on that makes it open things in a new tab. Okay. We'll click on some low hanging fruit to just see where we potentially are. If something catches my attention, I will click on it, doing some spot checks. But the truth is I have mostly done a follow list cleanup around the A's, the B's, the C's. And I really should be going down much lower down there to the F's, G's, H's, or at the very end of the list. Yeah. In the past, for the past year, I've been using the fall list as a way of looking at games that maybe would be good enough for me to decide that I would want to put them on the wish list. But in reality, the truth of the matter is that I don't think I've bought a single game in 2024 at all this year. All of these games that are on the fall list, or the vast majority of them, are not ones that really catch my attention and that would be particularly something I would want to play. Now I did hear that maybe there was something different as far as the Steam family share, but I don't know what it is. If something's different, I haven't seen any announcement on Steam's RSS feed for announcements. If all of a sudden family share pulled back on the household rule, I'd be super happy about that. Although it may not really affect me too much. It may not. A lot of that will come down to whether my nieces and nephews ever got a computer, and frankly they may not ever get a computer that's capable of playing video games. And even if they do get one, it may be a long time from now. A lot of these games on the fall list may still be in early access. They're not out yet. And some of them might be adult games, so I'm going to try and avoid that. Yeah. At one point I had my macros doing a Steam fall list cleanup, but honestly having shorter streams on normal days outside of Christmas, it makes a lot more sense than doing the fall list cleanup publicly, since I've already kind of shown off all the games on the fall list anyways. But because I don't have it as part of my macros, and more importantly because my macros don't run consistently well, there's not really a point where I've been doing fall list cleanups. This one almost certainly is an adult game with a blur on it. Yeah, undoubtedly, as we scroll down here, the vast majority of these games are not things people would recognize. And in fairness, even if they did pass the fall list, the relevancy may be close to nothing by the time I actually covered the games. They definitely would be hidden gem type games, and games that I would hope to highlight if my channel had more viewers and more eyes showing up on that. And certainly making YouTube shorts is a much faster way to highlight a game in a very small amount and small way than it is to potentially try and buy these games and play them all the way through. There is also probably a factor there that eventually I would feel okay with just making a YouTube short for a lot of games without actually playing them myself. Unfortunately, I'm not getting more time. Nobody does in a day, so my ability to cover games is still as limited as always, whereas the number of games coming out is still a psychotically ever increasing amount of games. Yeah, and at a certain point I should stop following and even looking at adult games. The risk is just too high that some of that would get shown and get my channel in trouble. Yeah, it'll be personal victory just not to have some new strike or problem happen to my YouTube channel before the new year. Not that the new year is going to help much or change anything. And some of these games almost certainly have disappeared from the storefront, but it's not always the case that it's just like black screen if something disappears from the storefront. So again, it's not a great system. And yeah, undoubtedly you can see how this whole list of games is really long. And there are games that were just like announced at the Game Awards, like Dispatch, that definitely haven't been given enough time because they're not even out yet. Maybe there's a question as to why the Dolphin emulator isn't just installed instead of having it on the follow list. And there's, I guess, a question as far as some of these other games like Dragon Age Veilguard or Dragon Quest Monsters. Maybe they don't have any real relevance anymore, where they may have been relevant 6 months ago, a year ago. Some of these games certainly have been on this follow list for a much longer amount of time. There is potentially going to be a slight change once we get down to a letter, since I've been doing these in groups of letters in the past. So if we get to the F's and all of a sudden we see a lot more games, then I'll know I haven't done a follow list cleanup on the F's in a long time. There are only 12 months in a year though, so, and there are 26 letters in the alphabet, so that would mean roughly you would need to do one follow list cleanup every month of all the letters, which is not incredibly terrible as far as a thought goes. Fable is a great example of a game that's still not anywhere close to being released. There is an interesting thought certainly to be asked of myself, in that why am I so capable of starting an anime series on Hulu and watch that passively, but so incapable of playing games at that same momentum and that same amount? Now, I know the answer to some of that is because I'm lying down and resting and I can easily not pay attention, which I should fully admit that is the case, is that if I'm watching something on a streaming show, I often am not paying attention, often just turning over and falling asleep to it. Which, yeah, that does create a different situation. Yeah. I watched the Five Nights at Freddy's live action movie, and weirdly that does push me slightly closer to wanting to play Five Nights at Freddy's, but I'm still so far away that I don't think I ever really would do it. I feel like the game itself is probably not worth playing. Hey, and we may have just hit a point here where every time I click stop following on something, it just creates this long lag that maybe will just crash the page. This truly is a free solitaire. Why is it not just in my library? At some point I was trying to not just overfill my library with random games, but I think I'm probably fine at this point to go ahead and do that. Probably don't need to play a furry game, so I'll stop following that too. Yeah, I don't know why UI Vision is crashing every time. Like, I don't even know why UI Vision would even be implemented on this page. Did I try to make some kind of weird macro? triggers on clicks. I feel like I maybe did try to do that, but I clearly started a project, forgot about it, and abandoned it if that was the case. I don't even know how a macro would trigger on a click. Here's another adult game that almost certainly has been mislabeled intentionally. Yeah. Certainly it goes to show that because I'm only clicking on a couple of these, I'm only slightly interested in a couple of these games. The vast majority of the games on the fall list should just be forced in front of my face so I can curate them or get rid of them. Yeah. Now, no, don't think my macros really would do a good job of that. I don't think my macros on the fall list cleanup work at all. So that's not super surprising. Yeah, I was talking about nieces and nephews and the Steam family share. It's still very much the case, and it will be for years, really, that they are just too young for most games on Steam. That they are pretty much approaching TV Y12 as far as ratings, so PG, probably not PG-16. And the vast majority of games on Steam, if you were going to give them a rating, are going to be infra-mature, targeting 18-year-olds or older. Just on the violence aspect is why most games are infra-mature. That's certainly something that Valve is going to have a hard time addressing or trying to fix, as far as there just has never been a lot of kid-friendly games on PC, and unless they were going to make an initiative to charge less for kid-friendly games, which people would try and manipulate that if that was the case, or if they were going to try to fund the development of kid-friendly games themselves, which Valve could do but probably wouldn't, that there's very little that Valve can do as far as PC gaming. So they are still putting themselves in this weird situation where they're making something that looks a lot like a Steam Deck. They're making a Steam Deck that looks a lot like a Nintendo Switch, but then they have a lineup of games that just don't really work with a Switch audience. Yeah, I don't know how you would really address that. The best bet is probably to fund the development of kids games. Certainly if Valve internally could make even one game that was kid friendly, that might be helpful quite a bit. They could certainly have a situation where they have specific sales throughout the year for kid friendly, or a specific section for kid friendly. I could certainly see a completely different age-gated Steam storefront for kid friendly that would be, I guess, closer to something like YouTube Kids, back when YouTube Kids really was something. But yeah, even if Steam was going to try and do something around a Steam for Kids website, it would struggle. There would be very, very few games. So sales are probably your best bet. Perhaps a bundle. Bundles would be a best bet too. Yep. That's probably something that Disney also should have been way more involved with too. It is kind of just crazy that Disney they should just disable this. Don't really have a way to disable it from there, do I? But yeah, Disney Plus, in the same way that Netflix is trying to have games attached to their cell phone launcher, it would make sense certainly to have a Disney Plus cell phone app that would also have a game bundle of some sorts. I'm losing my trains of thought here as I'm trying to talk and look at games at the same time. Weirdly, I think we could probably say no to Kind Words too, just because that's not a game I'm really gonna ever play. Yeah, one exception here. We've been scrolling all the way down to the K's, and the first game that really screams this is a kid-friendly game is Kingdom Hearts, which, yeah, I guess if you put your kids in front of that, that'll take up a year or two of their lives just playing Kingdom Hearts if they stick with it, assuming they stick with it. Of course, kids tend not to stick with things, and so then you have a situation where you might buy games and they get bored with them fairly quickly and move on. It is a shame that there really isn't direct emulation for Nintendo Switch games on the Steam Deck that is easy to do. It might be that you could do it, but I also wouldn't be surprised if the Steam Deck itself is just not powerful enough to emulate Nintendo Switch games. Plus, even if that was the case, you would need a adapter of some sort to read the cartridges. So if Nintendo and Steam all got together though, and they just combined a Nintendo Switch and a Steam Deck together, then you would have the ultimate device. You'd have a large lineup of Nintendo first party and second party kid-friendly games, plus you would have the entire lineup of more mature, at least TV 16 level games, probably mostly in for mature games. But even if you were going to try and cram the whole experience together. Now, if you're going to try and cram both types of hardware together, I don't think you could even squeeze both devices into the size of a current Steam Deck. Yeah. So I don't think it could even be a case. Like, I haven't seen any mods of anybody even trying to do something like that, where they tried to cram the internal circuit board of a Switch into the same circuit board of the Steam Deck. There would definitely be a lot of stuff that would overlap as far as batteries and screens if you can convince them to all work together, which would be probably a nightmare. I imagine the Nintendo Switch is designed to work with 3 or 4 types of screens at most, and doesn't have the hardware to run other kinds of screens. Battery really wouldn't be an issue, but CPU, GPU would be an issue, so you'd probably be cramming 2 different CPUs and GPUs in, or 2 different groups of RAM, 2 different connectors and sensors. If you could get the Joy-Cons to wirelessly connect to a Steam Deck, that would be a big step forward to the idea of cramming both devices into one. But yeah, it's not just going to be like a PlayStation 3 where you can throw in a PlayStation 2, or where the original versions of the PlayStation 3 just had the hardware of a PlayStation 2 built in, and thus you didn't have to do any emulating at all. We are just down to the L's, so I assume that means I have not made any faultless cleanups on the L's. Notice you have a game called Loop and a game called Loop, which is a nice example of how you can just have 2 of the same 2 games with the same name, and neither one is likely going to complain too much. This whole Lost Dreams series, I bet, is not something I want to follow anymore, considering how there's 3 different games there. But yeah, there is also a decent number of games here that we're scrolling past, and just I don't care at all about them. They're not, with the name and the screenshot and the thumbnail alone, it's just not enough to catch my attention. Yeah, I suppose this does point out that instead of watching yet another streaming show, when I get tired physically, I could try to do some faultless cleanup off the screen, and then see, even this Less From Beyond M edition is probably something that should be behind a adult blur like Less Than God here is. But yeah, I suspect that is not actually how I could ever actually pull it off. I imagine when I'm physically tired, I'm also just mentally tired also. So I imagine I really wouldn't do that, but I definitely need to do that. Yeah. One of the, I think it was the head editor of PC Gamer, apparently died and had cancer for the past year, and maybe he made that public, maybe he didn't. But the weird thing about that is that the first video they put out had somebody just kind of reading off a script, as far as what to say about him passing, which it doesn't feel like you really needed to make a video if you were going to do that, and you were just going to have somebody reading off a script fairly coldly. Perhaps you could argue that the reason why, I think we can just go ahead and stop following Marvel Snap. I'm not going to play that ever again. Yeah. Yeah, if you're just going to read it fairly coldly, I don't know why you wouldn't simply have the person not on screen. And yeah, it definitely is a weird situation if you know you have cancer and you know you're gonna die, just potentially scripting your own announcement, death announcement, or obituary. Perhaps not the best way for things to be done, but certainly could be helpful, I imagine, too, instead of expecting other people in their times of sadness to write an obituary for you. But yeah, I only watched about a minute or two of him reading it off of a script and then left. And maybe if you just made a YouTube short or something, well, maybe YouTube shorts aren't appropriate in that case, but if you had just made a minute video, that probably would have been the best, to just get out the facts as quickly as possible and then not go into a second paragraph. I guess if all the Metal Gear games are on the wish list already, we can take those off the follow list. But yeah, you can see it's reacting very slowly. Although UI vision isn't 100% of the time crashing. When I do that, it's just reacting extremely slowly. The Metal Gear Solid series is another series that I question I really ever want to play. Yeah. The weirdness here definitely also comes down to just the vast majority of these games on the follow list are things that aren't catching my attention, so there is an argument to just going through here with like a hot knife through butter and just unfollowing without even looking at the games, which I don't think that's particularly fair, and it totally breaks the whole system I had set up before this point. But you can see how now that I'm into the M's, I clearly haven't done a follow list on these in a long time, and there's a lot more games to scroll down through. And I haven't even begun to actually look at the actual games I'm opening tabs up on. The weirdest thing here would be if the window just crashed and all the tabs closed. That would be one way for things to end. Although, if you're going to go down that path, if my computer reboot, that would be another way for streams to end. Particularly scrolling through all of these games, this is where it feels like it would just be really nice to have a secretary or an assistant or some other content creator who could specialize on this one thing, as far as just going through the follow list and following the rules. Although if I'm not looking at the follow list and I'm not curating games for myself, I'm not making decisions as far as what games I would really want to cover and play, inherently I'm falling directly into the trap that most mainstream video game journalists run into, which is they get very busy with a whole bunch of other stuff and as such they start to make less and less decisions themselves and start to cover games just based on how popular they are and how big and what talked about they are. And then you have very much a cookie cutter repetition of every other mainstream video game journalist site where you're just talking about the same games as everybody else is talking about, just playing the games that are sending out review copies and nothing else. There's a game with AI in the name, that might be interesting. Now, it may be the case that the way my macros broke, that eventually I will hit a letter that I have done more curation on. But yeah, perhaps it would make a little bit more sense for me to have a more of a long-running series of content, whether it gets streamed or whether it gets recorded or what, but I could see just next year doing fall list cleanups from December 25th to January 1st, just saying, hey, now is the time to do the cleanup, now is the time where I can make some content while I'm doing some stuff. Yeah. But yeah, I don't think I really can justify doing it. Yeah, I could really just stop following that game. If I was going to play an NBA 2K game, it would be 25, not 24. Even if there is some reason why you should play 24 instead of 25. But yeah. Just now getting to the ends as far as the alphabet goes. And we may go through the ends fairly quickly here. So again, that might just have been a case. That might be it. That might be as far as we can go. Nope, it's just taking longer. Yeah, now I'm thinking, as I'm continuing to try and talk and make content while I'm scrolling down here, how could I make that kind of content but do it better? Yeah. I certainly could leave all the tabs open and then make a bunch more YouTube shorts, which I already have way too many YouTube shorts, and I'm running well past the maximum number of things I can upload per day due to YouTube shorts. And so I would want some kind of other automated process. If I had a bigger audience, I could see maybe trying to do some kind of interaction, possibly even have games pop up and have the audience vote for them. But I would have to have a very high audience, and even that would really just be the tyranny of who happens to actually vote, enforcing will instead of putting my own desire as far as what games I would even want to begin to consider playing. So yeah, we could certainly have some interactivity, but it couldn't really affect whether I say yes or no to a game. So yeah, I'm trying to think if there was a more interesting way to go through these, or a faster way to go through these. My macro would definitely open these tabs faster. I could certainly use another extension to open all of the tabs in a group. I can't open every single tab though. That's too much, and it would just get me blocked for several hours by Steam for opening too many tabs at once, opening too many pages at once, looking like I was a bot scraping it. Yeah, trying to scrape the entirety of the Steam database, potentially, or a large portion of it. But yeah, it certainly would be nice if there was a way to just get it to pop open a page. And it's interesting how many adult games start with Paradise as the name. It'd be nice if it could just pop up the page and then tell me, ask me to click a thumbs up or thumbs down on a game. Which, in fairness, that was what my macro was most recently programmed to kind of do, is to go through them and present only the ones that really need a decision. But yeah, I don't think that's working, and certainly I'm not using it properly. If it is working, I'm not using that macro at all, so yeah. It certainly does speak to the amount of games and the quality of games, though, that are available and that came out this year. Because yeah, the vast majority of these games are pathetically uninteresting. Yeah, and I think what I'm gonna have to determine here is, knowing that we've opened a few games, quite a few games, this is probably approaching the point where I want to call it. We've gotten down to P's, and even if I was just to scroll down and not click on anything and not really consider anything more, it still would be several more minutes before I got to the bottom of the page. Plus, I know that there's a lot more to do now that I've opened a bunch of tabs, that this really is just the setup step. I have to next actually look at these games. Lots of games with Project as the name. Perhaps Valve should put out something saying, hey, we've got a lot of games with Project in the name. You probably shouldn't call your game just Project something. Although, in fairness, calling your game Project something is still better than making a game that is just a one-word name, like Psych, which is probably not descriptive enough for your real advantage. there was a time where you could I could middle mouse click and just drag downward, and that would have scrolled all the way down. But if I do that now, I have that mapped to a gesture, so I would just close the page instead. And we went through Q's very fast there. We're into R's. Yeah, really at this point I'm just scrolling downward to show off things. You can certainly see also why this is a hassle. And the page is just not designed to have anywhere near this many games. They're expecting you to follow 10 to 100 games, maybe, not 400, 500 games. Yeah, if they put a lot of focus on it, they could probably speed up the process somewhat, but I imagine I'm uniquely one of the few people who actually has this many games on their follow list, so they really would be spending energy to benefit me almost exclusively. There might be a reason why, if they updated their databases overall, this would get faster. I'm still not sure whether I want to do more Rethink games or how many more Rethink games I really want to do. Some of these games like RetroArch are really software, and I have them on the follow list to see if there's any updates, although noticeably none of the softwares that I have in my library outside of the screen testing software, what is that called, PC Mark or something like that, none of those softwares I actually use. I don't use OBS, I don't use RetroArch. RetroArch really would be weird to use it. From the Steam version, when you can just install that as its own separate program and probably get a newer version, better version. Same is true with OBS. Even on the Steam Deck, I don't think I would install OBS and use OBS through the Steam store versus just installing the OBS flat pack from the desktop version of the Steam Deck. Which notably, that is still worth pointing out that there isn't really a great way, even with the Steam built-in video recording, to record footage at the same time. I still really would think if you are going to record a Steam Deck gameplay, which is not something I've really seen anybody do, you probably would just plug the video out of your Steam Deck into a capture card. Which I did not buy a capture card when I bought my new computer. Which, come to think of it, might have been a smart move to have done that, but I certainly could fix that issue later too, if it becomes a deal. But yeah. In retrospect, while I did enjoy playing around with my Steam Deck for a brief couple of weeks, I have also created a situation where I didn't play with it enough. So even though I heavily recommend the Steam Deck to people who just want to play games, I would say people who want to capture and be YouTubers and content creators of some sort should probably not get a Steam Deck. Even the YouTubers who are talking about Steam Decks on a weekly basis non-stop, I think have a hard time really making content with it. A lot of games starting SCP also. SCP still big enough, I imagine, to catch people's attention. A lot of games starting SCA also. Yeah, I want to just kind of power through this and go all the way to Z's, and then hopefully we can actually go through the games and actually do some flawless cleanup. Yeah. Question: buying Shadowhand Solitaire, which is just Shadowhand but with only the solitaire aspects, which is probably how I would have preferred to play Shadowhand, but I've already played it once and I probably will never play it again. And it's certainly crazy for them to sell the same game twice with just slightly different rule sets. And yeah, there's still a lot of games here. Lots and lots of games. I guess the question to ask is, how could I get through more games faster without just becoming very jaded and just making a bunch of quick looks? And I don't know if there really is a way to that. And certainly, I guess if there was a case where I just had cash flowing in like crazy and I was just buying games and making quick looks, which there is a certain point that if you became a content creator and you were very successful, that would make sense. But even PewDiePie doesn't really do that. Giant Bomb at one time was doing quick looks on games, but they also had the funding of major corporations behind them, and even they weren't going out of their way to buy random games on Steam to give them a chance or try them out. Yeah. I still have to very heavily curate games based on the reviews of other people who have gone ahead of me to play games. Wow, there's several different Snow Brother games. And the irony certainly is the case that if a YouTube channel content creator was very popular, they probably would have become popular based on the success of playing certain games. So if they started to just do random quick look like games, they probably would lose their popularity to some extent. Speaking of someone who lost their popularity, it is worth mentioning that The Completionist has not put out a new video in 4 months. There's been a lot of accusations, and almost certainly confirmed accusations, of misappropriating charity donations against The Completionist. And I saw a new accusation that there's some other lawsuit that he's involved with. But certainly, just to take a step back, it is quite the fall from grace from being part of the new G4, which was at the time an amazing thought that a new G4 would have happened, to then having G4 completely fall apart and losing that job, and then also having his main YouTube channel content fall from grace because of accusations of misappropriating charity donations. Probably should just say yes to anything Star Wars. So few Star Wars games. See, even opening tabs now are starting to crash. There's just a high instability. And some of that, I imagine, is Firefox, but in fairness, Firefox doesn't have this instability outside of this one page. It's a way too long page. Yeah, things that didn't happen in 2024, certainly, if we were to make a list, now that I'm just talking very much off topic, we didn't fix the internet in any way. The internet has not gotten better in any way. If one could go back in time, and weirdly, we are possibly a step closer to actually being able to go back in time, as there have been some scientific observations of negative time, which inherently the discovery of a negative time, in that things might act, that matter might act reverse in time, whereas before there was a thought that only energy possibly went backwards in time, and perhaps not even that. But yeah, there are several key points in scientific discoveries that would have to happen, and this is in my own personal theory, before you could go back in time. And because those key points have to happen, those key discoveries, you would not be capable of going back in time any earlier than those key points, those key discoveries, without either being very risky and potentially undoing time, assuming it's all one timeline that's looping and that you aren't just creating alternate timelines. At which point, if you are creating alternate timelines, you can ignore any rules. But assuming you are capable of affecting your own past, then you probably, if you're the wise people in charge of this, would never go back in time any further than those key discoveries. So it is not, in my opinion, and my own self-fictional thing, it's not likely that anybody from the future, assuming there is anybody from the future still alive and capable of traveling back in time, would come back any further than those key discoveries. And so if we are at the point of discovering negative time, then that's one key discovery. There may be thousands of other key discoveries that have to happen, and it may be that the science proves that human beings or human consciousness can never travel back in time, and that we can't accurately send any other kind of physical items back in time to affect anything. But yeah, you basically have to create an anchor point, is my theory, with those key discoveries. Yeah. And who knows what would happen after that, how helpful that would be, whether that would do anything. It may very well be the case that going forward in time at a rapid rate might be way more valuable anyways, or you could take entire sickly dying populations of people and send them into the future to be cured, account for any kind of plague or mass die-off. Yeah. Who knows? And I went on that rant, and I know that there was a reason why I went on that rant, but I've now forgotten the reason. It does seem like we are going to get to the end, because after T's, it's just U, V, W, X, Y, and Z. So that's not too many games are going to be by those titles. There will also be some non-English letter games possibly at the very end. Yeah, but it has taken roughly an hour just to go through this and very flippantly click on a few games to do some follow list, which is not how I usually would do this. I see a game called Tax Heaven. I did see an article that apparently a bunch of people who were eligible for like a 2020 credit in the United States as far as their taxes, but didn't claim that credit, apparently seem like they're going to retroactively get that credit, which seems weird to me. It's never really been the way they've done it before, where they've gone out of their way to give money to people who didn't claim it for one reason or another, and I imagine that may cause a lot of confusion, certainly, too. A lot of people thinking it's a scam. And if it was a 2020 credit and people didn't claim it, then that means the US government has been making interest off of that that difference for several years, which, yeah. Excuse me. The US government is very good at taking people's income early and then giving it back to them after they've made interest on it for a long time through their income withholdings. But usually they only get about a year out of people. And in fairness, a lot of people who would be living paycheck to paycheck would further fall into trouble with the US government had they needed to actually pay taxes at the end of the year. And they didn't have withholdings. That being said, I think most people have way too high of withholdings than they really need. There are a lot of games that start THE, and it's interesting that they don't sort that in any way. But I guess it's easier to not sort it that with where it would be Castle of Time, the, which also means that we aren't actually as close to the end as I had hoped, because you're effectively starting all over again, aren't you? Now. Yeah. Is this gonna fix itself? Yeah, I think I've probably at this point completely exhausted myself. So it goes to show how, while it was fairly late into this year, I finally figured out by not playing Yu-Gi-Oh! I could make 2-hour streams and I really had enough to say in about 2 hours, whereas the case of this stream, which has gone 3 hours and 10 minutes, there's just not really enough for me to say after just a couple days, and a lot of what I'm saying is certainly just other news articles, which certainly is also questionable whether overall and over the course of 3 days I'm putting my focus exactly where it should be. Whole bunch of Legend of Heroes games, which clearly I haven't made the decision there, or I hadn't in the past, and I still haven't. Yeah, I wonder if there would be, instead of doing a flawless cleanup, which would make a lot more sense, if there would be a way for me to look at all the adult games exclusively that came out throughout the year. I think for my case, I'm probably just going to use that YouTube channel, Sex Positive Gaming, as my point of information on that. And just whatever their end of the year cleanup, their end of the year wrap up content says, is what I would gather from it. Now we're at the THE space starting with T, so we're almost done now. Relatively speaking. Also, my eyes have just kind of glazed over as far as what games I even want to look at. And yeah, I definitely don't want to do that on screen. That will give me an extra layer of safety, just in case something I clicked on actually was. Notice I'm just removing anything that has prologue in the name at this point. Some games actually have prologue in the name, and there is some element of gameplay there that's different, but I'm just not willing to do that. I don't think I actually played this game, so I could play that and do the same content a second time, but I don't see a real reason why you'd want to do that. As an interesting thought, that if they gave DLC to you in different form factors, it might convince a few people to play with different character classes, but it's still really a terrible system. Ideally, if Borderlands was done today, I kind of would prefer it to have been a season-based games as service one launcher to rule them all type experience, much closer to something like Diablo 4, where you're just picking a character and a character class, and you can just swap between them at any time or start a new game with a different one, which you can do that in Borderlands, but you can't play as characters from Borderlands 1 in Borderlands 2, which is annoying, which is exactly what I would have wanted to do. It still was a long time to get through the T's. Now, my theory is that the U's and the rest of this will be fairly short lists. I think I could say I'm probably done with Sudoku. I haven't gone back and tried to do a couple of Sudokus in the past week, and every time they're just really complicated ones that I just get 10 minutes into it and I'm like, oh, I don't want to spend another hour trying to solve this, or I don't remember how to solve Sudokus, so it was a mistake to try and play Sudoku in the first place. In retrospect, just how incredibly long that amount of time took. Although, in fairness, if I look back in this previous year, I don't know what I would have really done differently. Yes, I would have wanted to be more successful, as any content creator would have. I would have wanted to get more views. I would have wanted to, clearly I would have wanted to schedule things better and do things better. But over this past year, it's just been a major emergency for almost the entire year, leading towards really just a major emergency right now, which I'm still likely not going to be out of for months, if not even longer. Yeah, I guess had I not had to deal with all of that, I would have wanted to make a lot more content, and I would have wanted to start 2025 with being in the YouTube Partner Program, and then the hope is that being in the YouTube Partner Program for 2025 would somehow actually be financially helpful, which it probably wouldn't be. It would be nice. Certainly I really only need about 50 more subscribers and 1,000 more watch hours. So if I got 50 more subscribers and scheduled videos and put videos out, a ton of videos, and recorded a ton of content, I probably could get enough watch time. But I'd be so much on the cusp that it's questionable, and it's still questionable whether the YouTube Partner Program wouldn't just reject me being a gamer content creator, which they still don't care about that. It'd be nice if in 2025 they started to really try and support gamer content creators in a very different way than they support other content creators, because that is just a very different type of content that's being made overall. And yeah, I don't think YouTube's inclined to do that. I hadn't thought about this, but there's going to be a massive amount of things that just start VR on the fall list too. Well, not that many, I guess. And there's still something where if it says family friendly, I might as well not even try and cover it, because YouTube's definition of family friendly is probably different than the game developers. I don't know how to fix this system, though clearly there is room for improvement on the fall list system, but without getting the macros to run for it to be consistent, which I don't want to work on the macros. I spent way too much time this year working on macros and rewriting macros that still don't really work. But yeah, I need something that would just convince me to stay up on these games on the fall list, or put considerably fewer games on the fall list. And there is perhaps an argument to just put considerably fewer games on the fall list and reevaluate what is the criteria that something should be on the fall list. Because for this year in particular, it's just been me putting anything that I was going to make a YouTube short on. Now, in retrospect, it does just feel like there are way too many games here that I would never really want to play. And I'm bending over backwards and just being way too accommodating to put things on the fall list when it just doesn't need to happen. I can still make YouTube shorts for the most part, I won't make too many duplicate YouTube shorts for it to matter. Without putting things on the follow list. See, we may be almost at the exact end here if we're looking at X's. Although, still, some things with X's in the name. Those kinds of games, those mobile phone ad games, still are irritating me, particularly the Goblin Miner game, that their ads are just completely not what you actually do in the game. It's just complete false advertisement. Whereas the vast majority of games will have slight false advertisement with the ads to let you play that mode for a few minutes, then you have to spend hours playing a completely different style game. And yet that still seems to work. I definitely would like to see Google, here we are having letters with accents and symbols. Yeah, I'd like to see Google's advertisement on Android and their promotion of those garbage games become absolute zero. I'd like to see Google go through a full effort to develop and promote good games on Android. We'll see if that happens or not. It probably won't. And that's it. I was sitting here waiting for it to load, but nope. That is it. So it's taken 1 hour and 20 minutes to get through the fault list. And then it may very well be the case that every single thing I clicked on has taken me to a community page instead of a store page. Which, if that is the case, then that is just going to be more of that. And see, here's an example of a game where it is more than mixed reviews. It's mostly positive, which is my requirement. It is not in early access. And what is the other thing that might get it eliminated? It's not negatively reviewed and been out for a very long time, which, yeah. No reviews, less than 30 reviews, and been out for a long time, or negatively reviewed and been out for a long time. But yeah, every single thing I just clicked on is now going to require a secondary click to go through. Inherently also, anything that's not single player focused shouldn't really go on my wish list, even if it is very positive. Anything that's a card game that I'm not really going to play, which I don't even think this really is a card game. It seems to have a card game mechanic, but it seems to also have a lot of other things. It's also a fairly old game at 2008, so kind of hard to justify that also. And then you'll have certainly some things like this where relevancy has kind of fallen apart, in that the HBO series Westworld has long since been stopped being relevant, and so a VR game around Westworld doesn't really make a lot of sense. Okay, well, I could keep on going, certainly, and probably will off screen. Well, definitely will off screen, but I just don't think that there's enough of a reason to show off the games and do the fault list. I've had an hour and 20 minutes longer than usual to ramble, and yeah, I definitely could find some other things to do, and definitely could use another break. Anyways, so that's going to be it for this stream. Going a little bit longer than usual. As always, I ask and basically beg out of the goodness of your hearts for you to like, share, subscribe, comment, and watch as much as possible. Watch my videos 2 or 3 times, because all of that helps me potentially get into the YouTube partner program, in which potentially this could be a profitable business venture instead of just a massive waste of my time. Anyways, that's going to be it for the stream. Thanks for watching. Have a good evening.